Serious, what the most disturbing or creepy thing that you've ever witnessed in real life? My dad died of cirrhosis of the liver. It's not a pretty way to go. The worst part about it is that when the liver stops working the way it should, it causes a buildup of ammonia in the blood that can severely affect the brain. My dad was a former Marine and was always a very level-headed guy, so when his mind started to go, it was terrifying. I can remember one day him and I were alone and he suddenly started talking in gibberish. He stood up, walked to the middle of the room and started peeing his pants. I asked him what he was doing and he said, "What are you doing in the bathroom?" "I'm trying to go pee, get out." We were in the living room. A minute later, he collapsed on the floor and I had to call 911. It might not sound creepy to some, but seeing your parent like that is awful. I was outside work one day having a smoke when I heard something that sounded like a car crash, so I walked around the corner to check it out. Turns out a woman had hit an elderly man on a motor scooter who was crossing at a crosswalk with his elderly wife, also on a scooter. Sent him flying about 20 feet and his head was split open like a watermelon, blood everywhere. He was obviously dead. Woman gets out of her car, sees what she's done and immediately vomits everywhere and collapses. Horrible screaming that I won't forget from the man's wife while she just sits in the middle of the street on her scooter. That was some dickhead up shit. Pay attention when you're driving, kids. You are responsible for about 4,000 pounds of steel when you're behind that wheel. I'm a paramedic and have been for about 10 years now, and I've seen a lot of disturbing things, but one thing sticks out to me more than the rest. When I was still new, I went on a call for flu-like symptoms and the elderly lady literally had just fever, body aches and a cough with no other complaints, so we were all thinking she might actually have the flu. She wanted to go to the hospital, so we got her on the cot, and the design of her ground floor apartment with all her furniture made it impossible to turn the cot around, so we had to wheel her out backwards with me at her feet and staring at her face. We just get out the door when she lets out this horrible gurgle scream, turns gray and slumped over. My partner and another firefighter were next to her head and confirmed she had no pulse. We are close to the truck, so we load her up while I start CPR. As I start pumping her chest, she goes from this blank stare of the dead to looking right at me with this confused look on her face and started moving her arms trying to get me to stop, so I do. Instantly she was back to dead again, complete with blank stare and no movement. This time the three of us all confirmed no pulse, and so I continue CPR and she starts looking up at me again with that same confused look and moving her arms around again. Now I'm thinking this has got to be a mistake. She can't be dead and moving while I do CPR, can she? I stop, check. Still dead with no pulse. Resume CPR and yes, again she was looking up right at my eyes, moving again. So weirded out as I was, I just started talking to her to try to let her know why I was doing CPR on her, as my partner got the cardiac monitor defibrillator pads stuck on her. When I stopped for the rhythm check, she was in ventricular fibrillation. A single shock and we got a slow pulse back. Started the cardiac monitor's pacing function, and while she never regained consciousness, we got her to the hospital alive. Found out later she ultimately died at the hospital, but I'll never forget that look on her face while we made eye contact while I did CPR on her. I had no idea that could happen, but the doctor in the ER told me that if CPR is started quickly enough and the compressions are deep enough, you actually can remain somewhat conscious during it even if your heart is otherwise not beating. Has happened to me a handful of times since then, and so I always talk to my dead patients now while we are doing CPR, just in case. Walking with a friend on the sidewalk of a crowded street in the city I was living in a few weeks ago, there was a loud, terrible noise that made us both spin around, and I witnessed someone being launched into the air after being hit by a car and their body being mangled on the ground after impact. I rushed over and the person was obviously dead, eyes wide open, blood trickling out of mouth. I'm not deeply scarred by it since I've come to accept it happens every day, but I do think about it often. The only person who knows about it besides me is the person I was with and my closest friends. Would rather keep it in the past. A little boy went missing at a beach pond we were at when I was a kid. I was about 10, he was younger than me by a couple of years, I'm thinking he was about 7. We had seen the mom go from nervous anxiety to all-out hysterics walking around on the sand, then they announced a beach-wide search. All of the adults linked arms and walked out into the water searching. Everyone held their breath waiting. My dad came walking forward with this little boy laying in his arms, mouth so blue. He had found him literally submerged under the murky water in deep mud out away from the shore. His mother was screaming and pounding on his father's chest. The little boy had tried to swim to catch up to a little boat that dad had gone off in and he drowned. I remember thinking he was alive, despite the blue lips. I think he did spit up mud when they laid him out for CPR, but I doubt he was alive. Watching my dad walk out with him in his arms is something I'll never forget. We went to the funeral. The mother was inconsolable. You could tell that her and the husband were never going to get through this together. She clearly blamed him for the loss of their child. Was riding the subway and saw a guy dressed as a clown talking to a 20-something hipster girl across the aisle from him. This wasn't a fun circus-type clown outfit, think sleazy grease paint over day-old stubble, stained clothing type clown. Anyway, the girl seemed to be tolerating the conversation, not actively engaged in it. When she finally got up and got off the train, the clown stood up and went across the aisle, pressed his face against his seat and sniffed it loudly, then looked up at the rest of us with an unabashed grin on his face. Edit. To those suggesting he was a juggalo, I don't think so. He was dressed as a clown in addition to the makeup, full get-up with polka dot pants, big shoes and everything. Seemed to be his profession. Dude, this just happened to me a week ago. We went to Applebee's, yeah, those are still a thing, last week with our family. We have a big family, so it was like 13 to 14 people, and I have a lot of younger cousins. Anyways, it's hectic because there are a lot of kids and one of the kids asks to go to the bathroom. She's around 6 to 7 years old, and as I said, things were hectic, so she went by herself. Didn't really think much of it. I go to the bathroom about 2 minutes later, and in the front lobby, but kinda to the side where you can't see them, I see an elderly man talking to my little cousin. Smiling at her and making her laugh. At first I thought it was another family member coming in to say hi to her, but it was not. He was a charming guy, I could tell, well, at least to children, and anyways I see him take her hand and make way towards the door. I immediately go up to the guy and said, "Pooja, Indian name, I'm Indian, do you know this man?" The guy instantly froze and his face turned white. She said she just met him, and the guy immediately gave some really weird and vague answer that he was taking her out to take her to her parents. The guy was rattled. I knew immediately he was trying to kidnap her, and he knew that I knew. He immediately just left the Applebee's. It's not that creepy, and I'm not very good at writing or explaining things, but what scared me was just how casual and charming the guy was to the girl. Like he had no remorse, and you can tell he knew exactly what he was doing. What is even more frightening is this is a nice place in town, and my little cousin was just unattended for 2 minutes. I don't have kids and I would get mad at my parents when they were overprotective, but I completely understand why they did that. It's only been a week or so since, but ever since then I randomly will think about that man and how different my cousin's life could have been. So creepy how it can just happen so easily. The most disturbing was probably picking out what I wanted to be buried in when I was 21. I was about to have surgery and the neurologist told my parents there was a good chance I wouldn't make it. I still think about it sometimes, and I'm 44 now. I was pooping in a restroom in the back of a food court in the bottom of a large tower, a 60-story tower in Houston. It was a pretty small bathroom, and kinda out of the way, which is why I was there to do my business. Well, I'm just starting to wrap things up, and in walks a young man who proceeded to the urinal and does his thing. I only catch a quick glimpse of him through the crack in the stall. He seems to be in his mid to late 20s. When he is washing his hands, his phone rings and he starts talking, oblivious to my presence. I can hear a tinny female voice on the other end. I tuck my feet up and listen. At first he doesn't know who this girl is, but he quickly figures out that she's a girl he hooked up with on a recent business trip. He's going to be back there soon, maybe they can hang out? He asks. Maybe, she says, but she has news. She's pregnant and she wants to get an abortion. She wants him to pay for it. He agrees. He asks her if there is anything else he can do. Should he go with her to get it done? No, she doesn't want that. She doesn't really want to see him again. He was calm, supportive of her decision. They ended the conversation almost gently, as if afraid of hurting each other further. After he hung up, it was dead silent for about 15 seconds, and then he broke down. I stayed very still. I did not want to see this intimately into his life. I had only wanted to preserve a sense of privacy, but at this point I was committed. He cursed and cried for about 5 minutes, then gave himself a little pep talk in the mirror. This was, I learned, not the first time he had been in this situation. I waited a couple minutes before I left the bathroom. As I was walking back through the food court, I saw him sitting at a table with various professional-looking business people, all smiling and convivial, all evidence of the storm he just weathered gone from his face. I saw someone have a seizure in my freshman high school business class during the first week of school. It started as a fight, but the other guy swung a keyboard, this was in a computer lab, and knocked him into the edge of the desk, sending him spasming. The guy got tangled in the wires somehow and dragged the entire setup, as well as his neighbors, with him. So this guy is now partially suspended in the air having a seizure while our pregnant teacher runs to get the teacher next door who is certified to handle stuff like this. Everyone just stood up and looked over while this happened because no one had ever been in this situation. The girl sitting next to the guy was screaming and trying to help but didn't do much. The teacher comes in and gets to work untangling him and setting him down. I'll never forget those hollow eyes with a blank stare as his body convulsed. The guy who hit him with the keyboard also stole money out of his wallet at some point too. Disturbing for me, I saw an old lady walking down the street screaming stuff like, "Mom, I want my mom, where's my mom? I can't do it anymore, I can't," almost crying. She seemed so disturbed, so out of her mind. This is going to sound lame but it's my answer. I'm sitting on the couch alone at night watching TV, lights are off, and I've got my cat in my lap. Suddenly something startles my cat and he sits bolt upright, facing me, looking directly over my shoulder. His eyes go like saucers and the duck cur starts slow growling. Never heard him growl before. He was frozen, staring, didn't move. I've got nothing behind me, that I know of, but a brick wall with maybe a half-meter gap between the couch and that wall. So I'm frozen in place watching my cat who is frozen in place watching something behind me, and he is watching it intently. At this point there's no doubt in my mind from his reaction that there's someone behind me. He's only scared of one thing, strangers. Now if it was a bug or a moth his gaze would be darting and he'd have some playfulness about him. Nope. Not in this instance. He was locked onto something that truly scared him. He was a statue. Fight or flight mode. Eventually I get the balls up to slowly turn around. Nothing. I look behind the couch in the gap. Nothing. My cat settles and goes back to sleep. Either a Duck King ghost was in the room with me that night or my cat is an asshole. Scared the living shit out of me though. Like sheer, creeping fear as I genuinely thought someone had snuck up behind me. Edit, proofed. I was at a movie alone, and I came out to get some soda and there was a guy waiting outside the theater just looking off. I came out 45 minutes later to pee and the guy was in the movie theater just standing around in the lobby. There was something totally out of place about him. Dressed normal for the area, but he was looking around nervously and trying to avoid any sort of eye contact. So I look at the movie times and there are like 3 kids movies getting out in a half hour. I asked him, "Are you waiting for your kids to get out of a movie?" And he Duck King booked it out the door. It was a theater in a mostly empty strip mall and it was like 40 degrees Fahrenheit out, so he probably wasn't out for a stroll. I don't know if he was just a weirdo or if he had actual nefarious intentions, but it stuck with me. This isn't the most disturbing thing I've seen, but it's one of the creepier memories I have. I worked for an assisted living company for about 6 years. During that time I experienced my fair share of death. Some went peacefully, some went smiling, some went crying. Some went with family, others with just the staff around them. One lady went with something else entirely. I was helping out the nursing staff with resident wake-ups because someone had called off. One particular resident whom I was assigned to, we'll call her Catherine, was a hell of a woman. Loud, sassy, hilarious, and kind. She was very well put together and relatively fit for her age. This morning, however, I noticed that something was off. Long story made very short, within an hour she was virtually unconscious with severe heart failure. As we were already short-staffed, none of the nurses or aides could sit with her while she spent her final hours in bed, so I decided that I would stay and sit with her until family arrived. About 3 hours I sat with Catherine. She mostly slept. Occasionally she would mumble something or squeeze my hand, but mostly she slept with very slow, labored breaths. A nurse came in to let me know that Catherine's son was just about 20 minutes from the building, and that I could go home if I wanted to. What was 20 more minutes, though? I didn't want to leave. I'm sitting there with her peacefully, knowing that she was likely less than an hour from death. I remember very specifically looking at the clock to see how much longer until her son was to arrive, and the moment that I looked away Catherine shot straight up, stared around where the wall and ceiling met, and let out a blood-curdling scream. This woman could hardly breathe and hadn't moved a muscle in an hour. There is absolutely no explanation for her sudden strength. Nor do I have an explanation for the pure terror in her eyes. Catherine used her last breath with that scream. She fell back, white as paper, and was gone. The nurses rushed in to ask what happened. I barely got it out before I excused myself to the bathroom and I just sat there and shook for an hour. I've never been more terrified in my life. Catherine's son showed up about 5 minutes after. The nurses told him that she went peacefully and with people by her side. But she didn't go peacefully and I left her the second she passed. I have never been a believer in an afterlife, but this experience rattled me to my core. Edit. A lot of people are commenting about how they saw this before and wondering if I'm even up or if this is even true. I am up and this is true. I asked a question the other day on here about unsettling death experiences and this was my answer to it. Thanks for listening to another episode of Reddit X. Subscribe and activate the notification bell so you won't miss any stories. Feel free to share your own stories below in the comments. Have a good day.